The railroad had not carried a train through Elias Turner's farm in 11 years. The tracks were still there. 3 miles of rusted steel cut across the property from northeast to southwest, dividing his cornfields, pasture, and old apple orchard into separate pieces. Grass grew between the wooden ties. Young trees had pushed through the gravel bed. One of the signal posts leaned toward the ground, its black metal light filled with a bird's nest. To most people, the abandoned line looked dead. To Elias, it remained a daily obstacle. Every morning, he drove his tractor nearly 2 miles north to reach a legal crossing, then circled back toward the western field. The detour added almost 40 minutes to every trip. During harvest, those 40 minutes became hours. The railroad corridor was only about 60 feet wide, but Elias was not allowed to build across it. He could not remove the rails. He could not move his cattle through it without using the old crossing. He could not repair the collapsed drainage pipe beneath the gravel without written permission from a company that no longer answered his letters. The land belonged to him on both sides. The line between them did not. Elias had lived with that fact for most of his life. His grandfather had signed the original agreement in 1948. Back then, the railroad promised jobs, markets, and fast transportation for grain. Elias's father used to load cattle near the southern platform. Asa boy. Elias had stood beside the fence and counted freight cars as they shook the windows of the farmhouse. For decades, the railway had been useful. Then the grain terminal closed. Traffic slowed. Maintenance stopped. The final train passed through on a wet November afternoon without ceremony. After that, the company left everything behind. The rails, the rotting bridge, the clogged culverts, and the legal right to control the strip of land beneath them. Elias was 69 now. His wife, Margaret, had been gone for 4 years. His daughter lived in Colorado, and his son Caleb sold commercial property in Chicago. Both children wanted Elias to sell the farm. Caleb brought it up during nearly every phone call. "You are maintaining 400 acres by yourself. I have help during harvest. Seasonal help. It still counts. You could sell now and live comfortably." Elias usually changed the subject. He did not tell Caleb that comfort had never been the problem. The farm was difficult. It was also the last place where Elias still remembered exactly who he was. One morning in early March, he drove toward the western field after 3 days of rain. The county crossing was covered in mud. His tractor slipped twice on the incline. When he finally reached the low pasture, he found standing water stretching from the railroad embankment to the fence. The culvert beneath the tracks had clogged again. Water that should have drained toward the creek had backed into nearly 12 acres. Elias climbed down from the tractor. He walked through the cold water until it reached the tops of his boots. At the embankment, sticks, mud, and dead grass blocked the opening beneath the track bed. He could have cleared it in one afternoon with his backhoe. But the culvert sat inside the railroad corridor. The previous time he touched it, the company sent him a warning letter. Elias stood in the flooded field and looked up at the silent tracks. No train had used them in more than a decade. Still, they controlled where his water went, where his cattle crossed, where his machines traveled. That afternoon, he returned to the farmhouse and found a certified envelope in the mailbox. The return address belonged to Midwestern Freight Holdings. Elias opened it at the kitchen table. The letter was brief. The company had formally abandoned the Turner County branch line. The rails, T's, bridge structures, and associated right-of-way would be sold at public auction. Elias read the notice again. Then he unfolded the attached map. A red line crossed several farms, followed the river, and connected to the state highway north of town. 3 miles of it ran through his property. The auction was scheduled for 6 weeks later. The minimum bid was low, almost suspiciously low. Elias placed one finger on the red line and slowly followed it from the highway to the southern fields. He saw the route differently than the company did. They saw rusted steel, old timber, maintenance costs, Elias saw the highest ground in the valley. He saw direct access to fields that became unreachable every wet spring. He saw culverts, bridges, and a continuous path linking farms that had been divided for generations. The phone rang. It was Caleb. Elias told him about the auction. There was a short silence. "Do not even think about buying it," Caleb said. Elias kept looking at the map. "Why not?" "Because it is 3 miles of scrap metal and legal trouble." Outside the window, water still covered the western pasture. Elias traced the red line once more. "No," he said quietly. "It is 3 miles of road that no one else can see yet." Caleb arrived at the farm 2 days after Elias mentioned the auction. He had driven in from Chicago before sunrise. Still wearing the dark coat and polished shoes he used for client meetings. Mud gathered around the edges of both before he reached the porch. Elias watched him through the kitchen window. Caleb did not visit without a reason. Inside, he placed the auction notice on the table. "You cannot buy this." Elias poured coffee into a second mug. "I have not said I will. You called me and described the route mile by mile." "I described what is being sold." Caleb unfolded the map and pressed it flat. The abandoned branch line crossed 6 farms before reaching the state highway. Most of the corridor was narrow, overgrown, and difficult to access. The old timber bridge near Miller Creek had been closed even before the final train stopped running. Caleb pointed to the estimated maintenance costs: rail removal, bridge inspection, drainage repairs, liability insurance, environmental review. "You have been busy. I work in property. You sell warehouses. I understand bad land deals." Elias sat across from him. "The land is not bad. The railroad is. That is different." Caleb leaned back. "The auction included the rails, T's, signals, and whatever legal interest Midwestern Freight Holdings still possessed in the corridor." The wording was deliberately vague. In some sections, the company owned the land itself. In others, it held only an easement granted decades earlier. Some parcels might return automatically to the adjoining farms if the line was legally abandoned. Others might not. Buying the route could mean acquiring 3 miles of connected property, or 3 miles of lawsuits. Caleb tapped the page. "You do not even know what they are selling. That is why I am reading the records." "With what lawyer?" "No lawyer yet." "With what money?" Elias looked toward the cabinet beside the refrigerator. Margaret had kept their savings records there. After her death, Elias had moved the money into certificates and left it untouched. It was supposed to protect him if the farm failed. Caleb followed his gaze. "No." Elias said nothing. "That money is for retirement. I am retired." "You are farming full-time?" "That does not mean I am employed." "This is not funny." Elias lifted his mug. I did not laugh. Caleb walked to the window. Beyond the barn, the flooded western pasture reflected the gray sky. The railroad embankment formed a long, dark wall across the water. "You can sell the western acres," Caleb said. "Keep the house in the eastern fields." "To whom?" "There are investors." "There are always investors when land is damaged." Caleb turned. "It is not damaged. It is inconvenient. 12 acres are underwater because I cannot clear one pipe." "Then pressure the railroad." "I have pressured them for 11 years. "Take them to court." "With what money?" Caleb stared at him. The answer had brought them back to the same place. That afternoon, Elias drove into town to examine the auction file at the county clerk's office. The folder was thicker than he expected. Old dates, survey maps, tax records, handwritten agreements dating back to 1948. He spent 3 hours reading. His grandfather had not sold the original corridor. He had granted the railroad a right of passage for as long as trains operated on the branch. The agreement used one sentence that Elias copied carefully: "Upon permanent abandonnement." The right shall terminate. But later transfers had clouded everything. The railroad had widened sections, built drainage structures, and purchased small adjoining parcels. Ownership had become a patchwork. As Elias studied the maps, another man entered the records room. Victor Hale wore a tan coat and carried no folder. He greeted the clerk by name. Elias knew him by reputation. Victor had purchased several failing farms near the highway and converted them into storage lots. He rarely bought land without already knowing who would want it next. Victor glanced at the railroad file. "You thinking of bidding? Thinking is free." Victor smiled. "Sometimes." He pulled one of the corridor maps from the table. His finger rested near the highway interchange, then moved south, along the abandoned line. Not toward the scrap yards. Toward the farms. "You own most of this section, do you not?" Victor asked. "Land on both sides. That could make things complicated." "For whom?" Victor placed the map down. "For anyone who buys it without understanding the title." He left after less than 10 minutes. Elias remained seated. Until that moment, he had assumed the auction would attract only a salvage company interested in steel. Victor did not buy rust. He bought control. That evening, Elias walked the tracks from his barn to the flooded pasture. The rail tops were dull beneath the weeds. Every few hundred yards, he stopped to study the ground. The embankment stayed dry, even where the fields were submerged. The track bed rose several feet above the water. At the northern end, it met a county road less than half a mile from the highway. At the southern end, it crossed behind 4 farms with no dependable wet weather access. Caleb saw a liability. Victor saw leverage. Elias saw both. He stood on the old crossing as the sun lowered behind the trees. The auction was still more than a month away. He did not yet know the true ownership, the repair cost, or how high Victor was prepared to bid. But one fact had become clear. The railroad was not selling something nobody wanted. It was selling something most people had not understood in time. The auction was held in the county livestock hall on a Thursday morning. Elias arrived early. The room smelled faintly of dust, old wood, and cattle feed. Folding chairs faced a narrow table where 2 representatives from Midwestern Freight Holdings arranged maps and legal documents. Only 7 people attended. 2 were local farmers. 1 was a reporter from the weekly newspaper. A scrap dealer sat near the front with a calculator in his hand. Victor Hale stood at the back, speaking quietly with a man Elias did not recognize. Caleb arrived 5 minutes before the auction began. He sat beside his father without removing his coat. "You can still leave," he said. "So can you. I came to stop you from doing something reckless." Elias kept his eyes on the auction table. "That sounds tiring." The railroad representative explained what was being sold. 3 miles of abandoned track, approximately 9,000 wooden ties, 1 small timber bridge, 2 steel culverts, signal posts, gravel bed, and all transferable interests in the right-of-way. The sale was final. No guarantees were offered regarding title, environmental condition, structural safety, or future maintenance costs. Caleb leaned closer. "They are telling you not to buy it. They are protecting themselves. That is the same thing." The opening bid was lower than Elias expected. The scrap dealer raised his card immediately. Elias waited. Victor's representative entered the next bid. The price climbed slowly. For the first several rounds, Elias remained silent. He watched Victor instead. Victor never looked at the rails listed on the inventory sheet. He studied the corridor map. When the scrap dealer stopped bidding, only Elias and Victor's man remained. Elias raised his card. Caleb turned sharply. "Dad." The auctioneer announced the new amount. Victor's representative answered. The next bid pushed the price beyond what Elias had planned to spend. He had calculated the value of the scrap, the cost of clearing the drainage, and the money needed to repair the farm crossing. He had not calculated how much Victor wanted control. Caleb gripped the edge of his chair. "That is enough." Elias looked at the corridor map hanging behind the auctioneer. The red line ran from the highway to the southern farms. It crossed the flooded pasture. It followed the highest ground in the valley. He raised his card again. The room became quieter. Victor stepped forward and whispered to his representative. Another bid came. Elias felt the number in his chest. To continue, he would need almost all of Margaret's savings. He remembered the last year of her life. The hospital bills, the medicines, the envelope she had kept in the kitchen cabinet. She had once told him the money was not meant to be protected forever. It is meant to protect what matters, she had said. At the time, he thought she meant the house. Now he was not sure. Caleb spoke under his breath. If you bid again, you will have to borrow against the farm. I know. You could lose everything. Elias looked at him. I could lose half of it without doing anything. The auctioneer asked for another bid. Elias raised his card. Victor's representative responded almost immediately. The price rose again. This time, Elias hesitated. He looked toward Victor. Victor's expression was calm, but one hand pressed tightly around the back of a chair. That told Elias more than the bid itself. Victor needed the corridor. Elias raised his card one final time. The amount was high enough that the reporter stopped writing. Victor whispered to his representative. The man shook his head. For several seconds, no one moved. The auctioneer called once, twice. Victor stared directly at Elias. Then he stepped back. Sold. The wooden hammer struck the table. Caleb closed his eyes. Elias remained still. He had won 3 miles of abandoned railroad. He had also spent nearly every dollar he and Margaret had saved over 4 decades. After the papers were signed, the reporter approached him outside. Mr. Turner, what do you plan to do with the tracks? Nothing yet. Are you going to sell the steel? No. Restore the railway? No. The reporter frowned. Then why buy it? Elias looked past him toward the flat farmland south of town. He could already imagine the headline, Old Farmer Buys Rust. Old Man Risks Farm. No one understands why. I did not buy the rails. Elias said, What did you buy? The ground beneath them. That afternoon, Caleb followed him back to the farm. They stood beside the old crossing as wind moved through the weeds. You mortgaged the eastern field? Caleb said. Yes. For this. Elias placed one boot on the nearest rail. The steel shifted slightly against a rotten tie. For the first time in his life, no company could order him away from that strip of land. No letter could stop him from clearing the culvert. No distant office could decide where he crossed his own farm. He looked along the line disappearing toward the highway. Caleb saw 3 miles of rust. Victor had seen a future toll gate. Elias saw a path that connected everything the railroad had divided. No, he said, for what this can become. Elias began inspecting the railroad the next morning. He carried a notebook, a measuring wheel, and the same steel probe he used to test soil depth in the fields. Caleb watched from the porch. You just spent your retirement buying it, he said. Now what? Now I find out what I bought. The first mile crossed Elias's eastern cornfield. There, the rails sat on a raised bed of crushed stone, nearly 4 feet above the surrounding ground. Grass had hidden most of it. But once Elias cut through the weeds, the structure became visible. The timber ties were rotten. The steel was rusted, but the foundation beneath them remained firm. He pushed the probe through the gravel. It stopped against compacted stone almost 2 feet down. The railroad builders had not simply laid tracks across the fields. They had constructed a continuous, elevated platform strong enough to carry loaded freight cars through wet country. Elias wrote one sentence in his notebook. The surface is ruined. The base is not. At the flooded pasture, he reached the clogged culvert. For 11 years, water had backed against the embankment because Elias lacked permission to touch it. Now the obstruction belonged to him. He brought the backhoe down that afternoon. Mud, broken branches, and several feet of packed debris filled the opening. Elias worked slowly, pulling it free 1 bucket at a time. After 2 hours, the final plug collapsed. Water rushed through the pipe with enough force to shake the reeds downstream. Elias shut off the machine and listened. The flooded pasture began draining immediately. By sunset, several inches of water had disappeared. Caleb stood beside the embankment. "You could have done this years ago. I could have been sued years ago. So you bought 3 miles to clear one pipe?" Elias looked along the track. "No." The next section crossed Miller Creek. The old bridge appeared worse than it was. Its wooden side rails had collapsed, and several boards were missing from the maintenance walkway. Vines covered the steel supports. Elias expected the foundation to be rotten. Instead, he found stone abutments anchored deep into both banks. The timber above would need replacement, but the crossing itself had survived decades of floods. 2 days later, Mason Cole arrived from the county water office. He had heard that Elias had purchased the corridor and wanted permission to inspect the drainage structures. Mason was 32, thin, and carried more equipment than Elias thought necessary. He studied the cleared culvert, then walked the embankment with a laser level. At the end of the afternoon, he unfolded a topographic map across the hood of his truck. "This line follows the ridge." Elias nodded. "I know." "No. I mean almost exactly." Mason pointed to the elevations. The railroad corridor ran along the highest continuous strip between the highway and the southern farms. Even where the land looked flat, the track bed remained several feet above the floodplain. "That is why the railroad put it here," Mason said. "Trains needed stable ground. And now it is the only continuous route through this valley that stays above seasonal flooding." Elias traced the line with one finger. The corridor crossed 6 farms, 2 drainage channels, and 1 creek before meeting the state road. Mason pointed to 3 low sections where water repeatedly collected. If these culverts were enlarged, the embankment could control runoff instead of blocking it. Could vehicles use the top, with the rails removed and the base graded? Yes. Tractors? Easily. Loaded grain trucks? Mason hesitated. Most sections? Probably. The bridge would need engineering work. Elias looked toward the old line disappearing behind the trees. For years, he had seen the railroad as a barrier. Now the shape of it changed in his mind. The elevated bed was not only a road. It could carry drainage pipes, water lines, electrical service, emergency vehicles. It reached places the county road did not. Caleb returned that evening and found Elias marking sections of the map. "What are you planning?" "A farm road." "For us? For anyone south of the creek who needs it?" Caleb stared at him. "You mortgaged your land to build a public road?" "I did not say public." "Then you plan to charge people?" "I did not say that either." Caleb pulled out a chair. "Dad, you need a plan that includes money." Elias looked at the map. The route connected fields that had been separated for generations. It gave the western acreage direct access to the highway. It crossed ground that stayed dry when every other route turned to mud. He had known parts of this before the auction, but now the full value was visible, not in the rails, not in the timber. In continuity, you look at land parcel by parcel. Elias said, "That is how ownership works." "Maybe." He drew one line from the highway to the southern boundary. "But water does not care about property lines." Caleb said nothing. Neither do roads. The next morning, Elias painted a white mark on the first rail he planned to remove. 3 miles still lay ahead. Brokenties, a dangerous bridge, legal questions, costs he could not yet calculate. But the old line no longer looked abandoned. It looked unfinished. Elias began removing the rails near the old cattle crossing. He chose that section because it was closest to the barn and farthest from Miller Creek. If the plan failed, at least he would not strand machinery beside the damaged bridge. Samuel Dean, a retired mechanic from the next county, brought an old cutting torch and a truck with a small crane mounted behind the cab. When he saw the rails, he laughed. "You bought all of this? 3 miles. You know steel gets heavier when you own it." Elias handed him a pair of gloves. The first bolts did not move. Years of rust had fused the metal plates to the wooden ties. Elias soaked them with oil. struck them with a hammer, and tried again. Nothing. Samuel heated one bolt until it glowed red. The nut finally broke loose, but the force threw Elias backward into the gravel. He stayed on the ground for a moment, breathing through the pain in his shoulder. Samuel shut off the torch. "You all right?" "I will be." "That is not what I asked." Elias sat up. The rail beside him looked unchanged. One bolt removed, thousands remained. By the end of the first day, they had cleared less than 30 feet. The ties underneath were worse than Elias expected. Some collapsed when touched. Others were soaked with old preservatives and could not be burned or buried. Disposal would cost money. The steel had resale value, but not enough to cover every repair. The next problem appeared beneath the gravel. The track bed had been built for trains, not road vehicles. Its center was high and narrow. The sides dropped too steeply for tractors pulling loaded wagons. To make it usable, Elias would have to widen the surface and add crushed stone. He called 3 contractors. The lowest estimate was almost twice what he had left in savings. Caleb arrived that weekend and found stacks of removed ties beside the barn. He walked along the unfinished strip. The ground was uneven. Mud had collected where Elias had disturbed the old drainage. "This is what you spent everything on?" Elias wiped grease from his hands. "This is the first section. It is 200 feet. 240. Caleb stared at him. "At this speed, you will finish when you are 80. Then I should stop talking." Caleb did not smile. He opened a folder and showed Elias the mortgage payment schedule. The first major payment was due after harvest. Corn prices had fallen. The western field had only recently drained. If the yield was weak, Elias would have to sell equipment or acreage. "You do not have time to prove a theory," Caleb said. "It is not a theory. There is no road. There is a foundation. There is rust, rotten wood, and debt." Elias turned away. Caleb followed him toward the equipment shed. "You always do this." Elias stopped. "Do what?" "Decide something alone. Then make everyone else live with it." The words reached deeper than the argument. Margaret had said something similar during the final years of their marriage. Not about the railroad. About the farm. About how Elias treated every hardship as a private burden and every decision as his responsibility alone. He looked at Caleb. "You think I should have asked permission. I think you should have asked for help. I knew what you would say." "That is not the same thing." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Caleb looked toward the unfinished track. "Where does this road even lead?" Elias pointed north. "The highway? And south?" "4 farms. The creek. The county line?" Caleb shook his head. "That is not what I meant." Elias knew. Caleb wanted numbers. Customers. Contracts. A way to recover the money. Elias had none. "It leads where the county road cannot," he said. "That is not a business plan." "No." "What is it?" "A reason to finish." Caleb left before dinner. The next morning, heavy rain moved across the valley. Elias covered the equipment and walked the cleared section. Water ran down the disturbed gravel and collected in a deep rut. One side of the new roadbed began washing away. He brought the tractor out to reinforce it. The rear wheel sank. Elias tried reversing. The tire spun deeper. By noon, the tractor sat, tilted toward the ditch, buried to the axle. Samuel arrived with a chain. Together, they pulled for 2 hours before freeing it. Elias stood in the rain, staring at the damaged section. The first road he had built had failed before a single truck used it. That evening, he opened his notebook. He wrote the costs, the damaged gravel, the unstable slope, the disposal problem. Then he added one final line. "The railroad knew how to carry weight. I do not yet know how to turn it into a road." For the first time since the auction, Elias allowed himself to consider that Caleb might be right. He had not bought a path. He had bought the responsibility to build one. And responsibility was always more expensive than ownership. The rain began on Tuesday and did not stop. By Thursday morning, Miller Creek had climbed over its banks. Water spread across the southern fields in wide brown sheets, swallowing fence posts, drainage ditches, and the lowest section of County Road. Elias stood beneath the barn roof and watched the valley disappear. The weather radio repeated the same warning every 15 minutes. Flash flooding, road closures, residents should avoid low crossings. At 10 o'clock, Ruth Bennett called. Her voice shook. The bridge by Dawson's Place is underwater. Stay home. I am home. Samuel is not. Elias looked toward the southern ridge. Samuel had driven to the feed store before sunrise. His cattle had enough hay, but almost no grain. If the county road closed behind him, he would not be able to return with the truck. I will call him, Elias said. Samuel answered on the fourth ring. I am at the highway, he said. Sheriff's deputy blocked the turn. Leave the truck there? With 3 tons of feed in it? Can you reach the north end of the rail corridor? There was a pause. You mean your unfinished road? The base is higher than the fields. The section near the creek is still track. Bring the feed as far as you can. Elias hung up and started the tractor. The first 200 feet of converted road were damaged, but passable. Beyond that, the old rails continued south beneath grass and standing water. The flood had changed the landscape. Everything low had vanished. The railroad embankment remained visible like a dark spine across the valley. Elias drove onto it. The tractor tires bounced over the wooden ties. The ride was slow and violent, but the machine stayed above the water. At the northern end, Samuel waited beside his feed truck. The county road behind him was already closed. Together, they transferred bags of grain onto Elias's wagon. We cannot cross the bridge, Samuel said. We do not need to. Elias pointed toward an old maintenance ramp he had found during the survey. It dropped from the rail bed onto higher pasture east of Miller Creek. The slope was overgrown, but solid. They cut the first load free with chainsaws and shovels. By noon, Elias had delivered feed to Samuel's cattle. Then another call came. A dairy farmer south of the creek had lost power to his water pump. A family on Jensen Road needed medication for their daughter. 200 calves were trapped behind a flooded crossing with no dry route to higher ground. The county emergency crew could not reach them. Elias returned to the railroad. He drove the route again and again. Each trip revealed the same thing. The old line did not flood. Water pressed against both sides of the embankment. But the gravel base held firm. The railroad had been designed to remain stable under moving freight trains. A tractor and wagon barely tested it. By late afternoon, Mason Cole arrived in a county utility truck. He climbed onto the embankment and stared across the flooded valley. This is the only dry route south. I know. The sheriff's department needs access. They can use it. Mason looked at the tracks. Not with regular vehicles. Then we move what we can with tractors. Within an hour, the abandoned railway became an emergency corridor. Farmers arrived with 4-wheel drive tractors. A volunteer firefighter carried fuel cans. Mason marked the weak shoulders with orange flags. Elias directed every vehicle across the safest sections. No permits. No fee. No argument over whose land they were crossing. At dusk, a sheriff's deputy brought an elderly man from an isolated farmhouse. The man had been without oxygen for nearly an hour. The ambulance waited at the highway. Elias drove slowly, keeping the wagon centered between the rails. Rain struck his face. Below him, water moved through the darkness with enough force to drag fence wire and tree limbs across the fields. The old man behind him coughed beneath a blanket. Almost there, Elias called. When they reached the ambulance, the paramedics lifted the man inside. One of them turned to Elias. We could not have reached him without this route. Elias looked back along the railroad. Headlights moved across the embankment in a thin line. For 11 years, the tracks had divided the farms. Tonight, they connected them. Caleb arrived the following morning. He had seen footage of the flood online and driven through the night. He found Elias beside the northern crossing, soaked, exhausted, and directing another feed delivery. Caleb looked at the tractors moving down the line. "You planned for this?" "No." "You knew it would stay dry?" "I knew why the railroad built it high." Caleb watched a fire department vehicle unload supplies onto a farm wagon. The valley below looked like a lake. The rusted rails were the only continuous ground above it. For the first time, Caleb did not ask what the corridor was worth. He asked a different question. How much would it take to make the whole thing usable? Elias looked south toward Miller Creek. The answer was still more money than he had. But now he was no longer the only person who understood why the road mattered. "Enough that I cannot do it alone," he said. Caleb nodded slowly. "Then maybe you should stop trying to." 3 days after the floodwater began to fall, Victor Hale drove onto Elias's farm. His black SUV stopped beside the barn. Clean, except for a thin line of mud along the tires. Victor stepped out wearing a pressed shirt and work boots that had never seen much work. Elias was repairing a broken section of fence. "You have had a busy week," Victor said. "So has everyone." Victor looked toward the railroad embankment. The water had receded from the higher fields, but deep pools remained in the low pasture. Tire marks covered the old track bed where tractors and emergency crews had passed. "I heard you moved half the county along that line." "Not half. Enough to get people talking." Elias returned to the fence wire. Victor waited. When Elias did not invite him inside, he opened a leather folder on the hood of his vehicle. "I came to make you an offer." "For what?" "The corridor." Elias tightened the wire around a post. "You already had a chance to buy it?" "The auction was rushed." "You stopped bidding?" Victor smiled slightly. "I made a business decision." "And now?" "Now I am making another." He removed a printed contract and placed it on the hood. The amount at the top was nearly 3 times what Elias had paid. It was enough to clear the mortgage, replace the tractor, and leave money for retirement. Elias read the number twice. Victor watched his face. "You can keep using the crossing through your farm," he said. "We will grant permanent access." "Who is we?" "My company." "And what will your company do with the rest?" "Improve it." "For whom?" Victor closed the folder halfway. "Does that matter?" "Yes." "It is an abandoned rail line." "Elias." "Not a public utility." "It became one during the flood." "For 3 days." "For the people who needed it." 3 days were enough. Victor's expression hardened. "The county will not fund your road. The bridge alone could cost more than your farm earns in 5 years. You know that." Elias did know. The flood had proved the corridor's value. It had not solved the cost of rebuilding it. Victor tapped the offer. "This gets you out clean." Elias looked across the pasture. A week earlier, he might have considered the number impossible to refuse. Now he remembered the oxygen tank strapped into the wagon, the feed bags transferred in the rain, the line of tractor lights moving above the water. "Why do you want it?" he asked. "I told you." "Development." "What development?" "Storage. Distribution. Access improvements." "Where?" Victor's jaw tightened. "North of town." "Near the highway?" "That information is not relevant." "It is to me." Victor folded the contract. "You bought something you cannot afford to finish. I am offering more than fair value." "Then you must think it is worth more." Victor stared at him for a long moment. Do not confuse one emergency with a business model. And do not confuse age with blindness. Victor placed the papers back in the folder. "You have until Friday." "I do not need until Friday." "You have not even discussed it with your son." "That is because you are speaking to the owner." Victor stepped closer. "If you refuse this, the next offer may not be as generous." "Is that advice?" "It is reality." Elias rested both hands on the fence post. "No. Reality was what happened when the roads disappeared." Victor left without shaking his hand. That evening, Caleb arrived with groceries and a stack of county maps. Elias showed him the offer. Caleb read the amount and sat down at the kitchen table. "This solves everything. It solves the mortgage." It gives you security? It gives Victor the corridor. Caleb looked up. So? So why does he want it now? The flood proved it has value. Not enough for that price. Caleb studied the contract again. You think he knows something? I think Victor never pays for what something is. He pays for what it will control. They spread the county maps across the table. The northern end of the railroad reached a large tract near the highway interchange. Most of that land had recently changed ownership. The buyers were separate companies. Caleb searched the names on his laptop. 4 of them shared the same registered address, all connected to Victor. Then Caleb found a planning commission agenda scheduled for the following month. One item mentioned a proposed regional distribution center. The application did not include an access route. It did not need to. Victor had expected to own one. Caleb leaned back. He wants trucks moving from the highway to the southern farmland. And he wants every farmer paying for the privilege. You could still sell and negotiate protections. Contracts change. Not if they are written well. Companies change too. Caleb stood and walked to the window. You cannot build this yourself. I know. You cannot give it away either. I know that too. Then what are you going to do? Elias looked at the map. The corridor crossed 6 farms. 6 owners had benefited from it during the flood. 6 families now understood what would happen if one private company controlled the only reliable route through the valley. I am going to ask the people who used it. Elias said. Ask them what? Whether they want to own the road with me? Elias invited the 5 neighboring landowners to his barn on Saturday evening. He set out folding chairs between the workbench and the old grain bins. Ruth brought coffee. Samuel brought a tray of sandwiches. Caleb arranged maps across a plywood table. No one arrived early. The flood had made the corridor useful. That did not mean anyone wanted to pay for it. Miller Dawson, who owned the dairy farm south of the creek, spoke first. How much are you asking? Nothing tonight. Elias said. Then why are we here? To decide whether Victor Hale owns the only dry road through this valley? The room became quiet. Elias pointed to the corridor map. Victor controlled most of the land near the highway interchange. If he acquired the abandoned railway, he would connect those properties directly to the southern farms. He could build truck access. He could charge usage fees. He could decide which companies entered the valley and which farms received favorable terms. He offered me 3 times what I paid. Elias said. Samuel whistled softly. And you refused? Miller asked. Yes. You should have taken it. Several heads nodded. Elias expected that. He unfolded a second map, showing the flood boundaries. Blue shading covered the county road, both creek crossings, and nearly every low field. Only the railway embankment remained clear. Mason Cole stood beside the map. He had prepared a basic engineering estimate. The northern mile could be converted into a gravel road, with limited work. The central section required drainage improvements. The bridge over Miller Creek needed new timber decking and reinforced supports. The total cost was high, but not impossible. What is the county contributing? Asked Helen Price, who raised cattle near the southern boundary. Mason shook his head. Nothing yet. Then it is impossible. Not necessarily, Caleb said. Everyone looked at him. He explained a cooperative structure. Each farm could buy a share based on acreage and expected usage. Members could contribute cash, equipment, gravel, or labor. The corridor would remain privately owned by the cooperative, but emergency services would receive permanent access. Commercial trucks could pay moderate fees. Those fees would fund maintenance instead of enriching one owner. Miller crossed his arms. And who controls the prices? The members. Caleb said. Until someone sells their share. Transfers can require cooperative approval. Helen looked at Elias. Is this your plan or his? Both. Elias said. That answer surprised Caleb. Miller walked to the map. My dairy used that road twice during the flood. 4 times. Elias said. Miller glanced at him. You counting? I counted every load. Why? Because next time, We need to know what the road must carry. That shifted the discussion. The farmers began asking practical questions. How wide would the road be? Could milk tankers cross the bridge? Who would clear snow? What happened if a vehicle damaged the surface? Would the corridor remain open during harvest? For the first time, the meeting became about how to build the road, not whether it had value. Then Ruth noticed headlights outside. A white pickup stopped near the barn. Victor Hale entered without knocking. I heard there was a community meeting. No one invited you, Samuel said. Victor looked at the maps. I see Elias has decided to sell pieces of his problem. Elias remained seated. We are discussing a cooperative. Victor smiled. You are discussing debt? He placed several copies of a printed report on the table. The document listed environmental risks associated with old rail corridors, contaminated soil, treated timber, fuel residue, structural liability. Before anyone invests, Victor said, you should understand what you might be purchasing. Miller picked up the report. Helen read over his shoulder. The confidence in the room weakened immediately. Victor continued, my company can assume all liability, repair the corridor, and provide access agreements to participating farms. At what price? Elias asked. Market rates. Set by you. Set by cost. Your cost or ours? Victor ignored the question. He looked around the barn. You are farmers. You should farm. Let professionals manage transportation. Elias stood. Professionals managed it for 11 years. Victor's expression tightened. They abandoned the line. They abandoned the maintenance. Elias said, they kept the control. No one spoke. Elias picked up Victor's report. We will test the soil. He handed it to Mason. We will inspect the bridge. He looked at Caleb. We will write rules before anyone contributes $1. Then he faced the farmers. You should not join because of the flood. You should join only if you are willing to own the risk with the road. Victor closed his folder. Risk is the only thing he is offering you. Elias nodded. That may be true. He looked at the people who had driven tractors through rain, carried medicine, and moved feed along the embankment. But it would be our risk. Victor left. For several minutes, no one moved. Then Miller placed his hand on the map. I can provide 2 dump trucks and a week of labor. Helen stepped beside him. I can supply gravel from the south pit. Samuel nodded. I will repair equipment. One. The others began naming what they could contribute. Not enough to finish the road, but enough to begin. Elias looked at Caleb. For the first time since the auction, the corridor did not belong to one old farmer with a mortgage. It belonged to an idea the valley was finally willing to carry. Work began before sunrise on the first Monday of June. Elias stood beside the northern crossing as trucks, tractors, and trailers arrived one by one. Miller Dawson brought 2 dump trucks. Helen Price sent 3 loads of gravel from her family's pit. Samuel parked a welding rig near the barn. Mason Cole arrived with survey stakes, elevation notes, and a bridge inspection report tucked beneath his arm. No one had written a large check. No one could. The cooperative had been built from smaller promises: 5 days of labor, fuel for machinery, use of a bulldozer, a load of crushed stone, repair work after harvest. Each promise was written down. Caleb had insisted on that. Good intentions disappear faster than money, he said. Elias had disagreed with the tone, but not the rule. The first task was removing the rails from the northern mile. This time, Elias did not attack the bolts one at a time. Samuel brought a hydraulic rail puller from a salvage yard. A crew cut the rusted connections into manageable sections, then lifted the steel with Miller's crane. The work moved quickly. By noon, long pieces of rail lay stacked beside the corridor. Caleb watched the pile grow. We can sell that. For what? Road costs. Elias looked at the old signal post near the crossing. Not all of it. You want to keep rust now? I want to keep enough that people remember what was here. Caleb almost argued, then stopped. They agreed to save one short section near the barn. The rest would be sold for scrap. With every dollar returning to the cooperative, the ties created a harder problem. Many were too rotten to reuse. Others were treated with chemicals and required controlled disposal. Victor's report had exaggerated the environmental threat, but not invented it. Mason marked the contaminated sections. "We remove these carefully," he said. "No burning, no burying." The added cost troubled the farmers. By the third day, they had already spent more than expected. Then the bulldozer struck soft ground beneath the old bed. A hidden drainage channel had washed out years earlier. The gravel above looked stable, but underneath was a hollow space, nearly 12 feet long. The operator stopped just before the machine broke through. Miller climbed down and stared into the gap. "There goes the budget." Elias knelt beside the opening. Water moved slowly beneath the stone. The railroad had filled the top repeatedly, instead of repairing the failed pipe. Caleb studied the cost sheet. "We can cover it, but we lose the money set aside for the bridge." "Then the bridge waits," Elias said. "If the bridge waits, the road stops at the creek. A safe mile is better than 3 dangerous ones." Miller shook his head. "People joined because this was supposed to reach the southern farms. It will." "When?" Elias looked at the washed-out channel. "When the ground is ready to carry them." The answer did not satisfy anyone, but no one left. For 2 days, they rebuilt the drainage crossing with a larger concrete pipe and compacted stone in layers. Elias checked every load. He had learned from his first failed road, water had to be given a path before weight was placed above it. By the end of the week, the northern mile was ready for grading. The old raised center was widened. The steep shoulders were cut back. Gravel was spread and rolled until the surface became broad enough for 2 tractors to pass. On Saturday afternoon, Mason drove the first loaded truck onto it. Everyone watched. The truck carried nearly 20 tons of stone. It moved slowly along the finished section. No rut formed. No shoulder collapsed. At the turnaround, Mason stopped, reversed, and drove back. Samuel removed his cap. Miller smiled for the first time all week. Elias said nothing. He walked to the road and pressed the heel of his boot into the compacted gravel. The surface did not shift. Then a milk tanker appeared at the county road. Miller had arranged the test without telling him. The tanker turned onto the corridor, traveled the full mile, and stopped beside a temporary loading area behind the Dawson pasture. For years, Miller's trucks had used a narrow route that became nearly impassable after rain. The new road cut almost 4 miles from each trip. Caleb timed the run. 11 minutes saved one way, he said. Miller calculated silently. 2 daily collections. 7 days a week. Fuel. Driver hours. Wear on the truck. For the first time, the road's value could be measured without mentioning the flood. That evening, the cooperative members gathered beside the preserved section of rail. 1 mile of gravel stretched toward the south. Beyond it, weeds still covered the remaining tracks. The broken bridge still waited at Miller Creek. The mortgage still existed. Victor still owned land near the highway. But the project was no longer an idea drawn across a map. It carried weight. Elias looked at Caleb. His son was reviewing traffic estimates with Mason, arguing over numbers and maintenance reserves. This time, Elias did not see someone trying to take control. He saw someone learning why control had to be shared. The first mile had cost more than expected. It had taken longer than planned, and it ended before the creek. But it proved the most important thing. The old railroad could become a road. Now they only had to keep it from becoming someone else's. The first commercial trucks began using the completed mile in late June. At first, the cooperative charged only enough to cover grading, insurance, and routine repairs. Local members paid a reduced rate. Emergency vehicles used the road for free. The system worked. Milk tankers saved time. Feed trucks avoided the worst county crossing. Farmers could move equipment between fields without circling through town. Then Caleb proposed a larger contract. He brought the plan to Elias's kitchen table after dinner. A regional produce distributor wanted guaranteed access from the highway to a temporary loading yard near Miller's farm. In exchange, the company would provide enough money to begin repairs on the Miller Creek Bridge. Elias read the proposal carefully. The payment was substantial. So were the conditions? The distributor wanted priority access during harvest, fixed fees for 10 years, and the right to schedule large truck convoys through the corridor. This could finish the bridge. Caleb said, it could also fill the road with their trucks. Only during peak weeks. Peak weeks for them are peak weeks for us. Caleb leaned forward. We cannot keep building with donated gravel and borrowed machinery. I know. Then we need revenue. I know that too. Caleb's patience broke. Every time money appears, you treat it like a threat. Money is not the threat. What is? The person who gets to set the rules after accepting it. Caleb stood and walked to the window. Outside, the preserved section of rail caught the last light. You bought the line because you understood control, he said. Now you are refusing every chance to make it profitable. I did not refuse the contract. You have been reading the same page for 20 minutes. I am trying to see what it costs beyond the number. The next evening, the cooperative met in the barn. Caleb presented the agreement. Most members liked it immediately. The bridge inspection had revealed serious damage to 2 support beams. Without outside funding, repairs might take another year. Miller Dawson pointed to the payment figure. This gets us across the creek before harvest. Helen Price studied the traffic schedule. How many trucks at once? Up to 12. Caleb said, on a 1-lane bridge, they would cross in controlled intervals. Samuel looked at Elias. You do not like it. It gives one company priority over the people who built the road. Miller frowned. They are paying for the bridge. They are paying for access. That is how business works. Elias nodded. Yes. Which is why the details matter. He placed a revised agreement on the table. The distributor could use the corridor, but no exclusive time blocks would be allowed. Cooperative members would retain priority for livestock emergencies, harvest breakdowns, and local deliveries. The rate would be reviewed every 2 years. Truck numbers would be limited, and no company could purchase voting rights in the cooperative. Caleb read the changes. They will reject this. Then they do not want access. They want control. Miller pushed back his chair. We may lose the only money available. We may. And if the bridge stays closed, then we repair it slower. The room divided. Some members supported Elias. Others believed he was protecting principles they could not afford. The vote ended in a tie. As chairman, Elias held the deciding vote. Caleb looked at him. For a moment, Elias saw the same anger he had seen after the auction, but beneath it was something else. Fear. Caleb had invested weeks building the financial plan. He had negotiated the contract, calculated the traffic, and convinced the distributor that the road was viable. To reject it would not only delay the bridge, it would reject his son's work. Elias closed the original agreement. We send the revision. Caleb's face hardened. You know they will walk. Maybe. You would rather lose the deal than compromise. No. I would rather lose one deal than lose the road. The distributor responded 2 days later. They rejected the 10-year fixed rate. They accepted everything else. The company needed the route more than Caleb had realized. When he brought the signed agreement to the farm, he placed it silently on the table. Elias read the final page. You did good work. Caleb gave a tired laugh. After you rewrote all of it, I changed the terms. You made them stay. That afternoon, they drove to Miller Creek. Engineers had already marked the damaged supports with red paint. The water below was low and clear. Caleb stood on the old bridge, looking through the gaps in the rotting deck. I thought you did not trust me, he said. Elias rested his hands on the rail. I did not trust how fast you wanted to move. That is not the same thing? No. Caleb looked toward the completed mile. Then what do you trust? Elias considered the question. I trust you to see value. And the problem? You see it before you see who might get hurt by it. Caleb nodded slowly. And you see danger before opportunity. That is probably true. For the first time, neither of them tried to win the argument. Below them, Miller Creek moved beneath the bridge that separated the finished road from the farms beyond. They now had the money to cross it. But more importantly, they had agreed on what the road would never become. Not a toll gate, not a private empire, not another barrier owned by someone too distant to understand the land. It would earn money. It would carry trucks. It would grow. But control would remain with the people who depended on it. Victor Hale filed for an emergency injunction 3 weeks before the bridge reopened. His company did not claim ownership of the entire corridor. It did not need to. The complaint argued that Elias had purchased the rails, and whatever interests the railroad could legally transfer, but not automatic ownership of every section beneath them. Several original agreements had granted only temporary railway easements. Once train service ended, those rights might have returned to the neighboring landowners. Victor controlled companies that had recently purchased land beside the Northern Mile. If the judge accepted his argument, he could block the road at its connection to the highway. 3 miles of work would become a road leading nowhere. Caleb read the complaint at the kitchen table. He found the one section we have not fully documented. Elias nodded. Before construction began, 5 families had signed access easements into the cooperative. Their records were clear. The Northern Mile was different. The county archive contained later transfers describing the corridor as railroad property, but the original Mercer family agreement was missing. Work on the bridge stopped. The produce distributor suspended its advance payment. Helen Price refused to spend more cooperative money until the title question was settled. Miller Dawson argued that stopping was exactly what Victor wanted. At the meeting, everyone turned toward Elias. I cannot promise we will win, he said, but I can promise we will not build over a question we have refused to answer. The cooperative hired a title attorney using its emergency reserve. For 12 days, Caleb searched tax records, probate files, survey notes, and old railroad correspondence. Mason compared historical maps with the modern corridor. Elias visited the descendants of every family that had once owned land beside the northern section. Most remembered nothing useful. Then Owen Brooks, a retired sheriff whose father had worked in the county survey office, brought Elias a box of copied field notes from a boundary dispute in the 1970s. The papers did not contain the missing deed, but one survey referenced it by date, book number, and the name Ruth Bennett Mercer. Ruth Bennett was the granddaughter of the original landowner. Elias and Caleb searched the county archive again using the reference. The deed was not in the railroad file because it had been recorded under the Mercer estate. They found it in a probate volume no one had opened in decades. The agreement granted the railroad passage only while the branch remained in continuous railway use, pont permanent abandonnement. The easement would terminate and control would return to the landowner or lawful successors. Ruth and 2 other Mercer heirs signed a new access easement, granting the cooperative permanent use of the corridor. Victor's attorneys challenged the signatures and asked the court to freeze construction until a full title trial could be held. At the injunction hearing, the judge did not decide every ownership question. She decided whether Victor had shown enough evidence to stop the road immediately. The cooperative presented the original agreement, probate records, modern surveys, and signed easements from the current heirs. Victor presented later railroad maps that described the route as company property, but did not show how that ownership had been obtained. The judge denied the injunction. Victor could continue the lawsuit. He could not block the bridge while claiming rights his company had not yet proved. 2 months later, after document discovery confirmed the railroad had never purchased the Mercer land, Victor withdrew the claim. Outside the courthouse, a reporter asked Elias what had saved the road. He looked at Caleb carrying 3 folders of deeds. surveys, and signed agreements. Not one forgotten paper, Elias said. What? Then, enough people willing to follow the record until it reached the truth. Bridge work resumed the following morning. The rails had been abandoned. The rights beneath them had not disappeared. They had simply become scattered across families, archives, and years, and the road could survive only after those pieces were connected. The bridge reopened on the first Monday of October. No ribbon had been ordered. No stage had been built. At sunrise, the cooperative members gathered beside Miller Creek, while Mason inspected the final bolts beneath the new timber deck. The restored bridge looked simple. Fresh planks, steel reinforcement, gravel packed tightly at both ends. But it completed what Elias had seen on the old auction map. 3 uninterrupted miles from the southern farms to the state highway. Mason stepped away from the railing. It is ready. No one cheered immediately. They looked toward the first truck waiting on the southern side. Miller Dawson sat behind the wheel of his milk tanker. He eased forward. The tires reached the bridge. The structure creaked once, then settled beneath the weight. Everyone watched the supports. Nothing moved. The tanker crossed the creek and continued north along the former railroad bed. Helen followed with a loaded grain truck. Then came a feed delivery, 2 tractors, and a county ambulance conducting an emergency access test. Within 20 minutes, the old railway was carrying more useful traffic than it had during its final years of operation. Elias stood beside the preserved section of rail near the barn. A small wooden sign had been placed beside it. Turner Valley Cooperative Road, former Midwestern branch line. Caleb had designed the sign. Elias had objected to the first name. Caleb wanted to call it Turner Road. It does not belong to one family, Elias had said, so they named it for the valley. The road changed the farm slowly at first. Milk deliveries became more reliable. Fuel costs dropped. Farmers combined shipments at a loading yard near the highway and negotiated better prices because buyers no longer had to send separate trucks down narrow county lanes. When heavy rain returned the following spring, water moved through the enlarged culverts. Instead of backing into Elias's pasture, the western field stayed dry. For the first time in 11 years, Elias drove directly from his barn to those acres without leaving his own land. He made the trip in 6 minutes. The old route had taken nearly 40. At the far end, he stopped the tractor and looked back. The road followed the raised ridge in a pale gray line. He remembered standing in the same field while water filled his boots, unable to clear a blocked pipe, because a distant company controlled the ground beneath him. Now the culvert was open. The fields were connected, and the corridor could never be sold without approval from the cooperative members. Caleb made sure of that. The final legal structure placed the road into a community land trust. Farms could buy or transfer usage shares, but no single company could gain majority control. Victor Hale approached them one final time. His distribution project had been approved, but without ownership of the corridor, he needed a transportation agreement. The cooperative allowed his trucks to use the road. They charged the same commercial rate offered to every other business. No exclusive hours. No special voting rights. No private gate. Victor signed because he had no better route. The first payment from his company covered winter grading for the entire road. Caleb showed the figures to Elias one evening. The corridor will pay for itself this year. Elias studied the report. And the mortgage? Cleared by next harvest. You sound disappointed? Caleb smiled. I was hoping you would admit it was a good investment. It was a terrible investment. Caleb stared at him. Elias closed the folder. It was too expensive, legally uncertain, and nearly impossible to repair. Then why did it work? Because enough people needed it. That sounds like value. It is. But value and investment are not always the same thing. Caleb sat across from him. Then what did you think you were buying? Elias looked toward the kitchen cabinet where Margaret had once kept their savings records. He had asked himself that question many times. At the auction, he believed he was buying access to his western field. Lauter. He thought he was buying protection from Victor. During the flood, he thought he had purchased a route that might save lives. All of those answers were true. None was complete. I was buying the chance to decide what happened next, he said. 3 years later, Elias stopped farming the full 400 acres. He leased part of the land to a younger family and kept the orchard, cattle pasture, and western field. Caleb began spending more time in the valley. He still worked in property, but now he advised rural cooperatives on shared roads, storage sites, and land trusts. On the anniversary of the auction, father and son walked along the preserved rails. Trucks moved quietly on the gravel beside them. Caleb touched the rusted steel. Everyone thought you bought 3 miles of this. So did the newspaper. What should the headline have said? Elias looked down the road toward the highway, then south toward the farms it connected. The rails had been forgotten because they no longer carried trains. The land beneath them had never lost its purpose. People had simply stopped asking where it led. Elias put his hands into his coat pockets. Old farmer buys the right to keep his neighbors connected. Caleb laughed. Too long for a headline. Most true things are. They continued walking. Years earlier, no one had understood why an old man would risk his savings on 3 miles of abandoned railroad. Now every truck, tractor, ambulance, and farmer using the road carried the answer. Elias had not bought what the railroad left behind. He had bought what the valley still needed.